Okay. All right. Let's get started. There are still a few empty seats. There are a few around here, and there are a few on the other side of the room. Let me just welcome you to the Pioneers panel on the 50th year in or of experimental economics. I'm gonna mention just that after this event, we have the reception over at the San Catalina Ballroom. Some of you may have already been over there this morning. The Choya rooms, Saguaro, Ocotillo, those are in the San Catalina Ballroom. So we have champagne, wine, and hors d'oeuvres. And at this point, I'll let Dan take over, and he's going to handle the introductions. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John. This has been a great honor and pleasure to put this together with John, this panel of pioneers. It looks like 3, but we actually have 4. And so each of them will speak for 5 minutes, maybe 10. And then I'll maybe seed things with just whatever they want to tell us about. Maybe I'll throw a few questions out for them to discuss as a panel. And then I'll open it up to questions from the floor for the remaining time until the champagne calls us. So let me begin with Reinhard Zelten, a pioneer from Europe. And he's been at Bonn since 1984, which is where I first met him. But an earlier career at Bielefeld. Many of you know he got the Nobel Prize for something else in 1994, but he always regarded his work in experimental economics as the true scientific contribution that he was making. And he began that right at the beginning as a graduate student working with Professor Zauerman in the 1950s. You'll see a video, he may say a little more about that in a few minutes. Next up, I'm doing all the introductions now because I don't want to interrupt there. Next up will be John Cagle, who's currently a university chaired professor at Ohio State, been there since '99. I'm mentioning some of these other places. These are important touchstones for experimental economics. So his early work at Texas A&M and Houston before that, and at Pittsburgh were all important stops along the way. He has many honors now, one of which is Fellow of the Econometric Society. Purdue is an important way station. That's where he got his PhD. And he got into humans sort of later in the game. He was doing some experiments with other animals before that. Charlie Plott will be up next. He's been at a fixture at Caltech since 1971. As many of you know, before that, he came out of the great state of Oklahoma and did his PhD at the University of Virginia. His assistant professor appointment was at Purdue, where I think he first caught the bug. Maybe he'll tell us more about that, to do experiments. He's also a fellow of the Econometric Society and is the person who's done a lot to establish the field everywhere, but especially at Caltech. There's a lot have come up from Caltech since Charlie joined there. And the last speaker will be Vernon Smith, who is, as you know, now at Chapman University. He got there by a winding route and did it I guess from Kansas originally, but Caltech, I like to, as a California, I want to claim credit for state of California, but I don't know, he didn't do experiments there. He went to a PhD at Harvard, and his first appointment was at Purdue, which is, I understand, where the experiments really began. Important, well, a short stop at UMass, long stop right here at Arizona, and that's why we're here today as opposed to somewhere else. Started the tradition at this very place, Westward Look Resort, of organizing things, and in fact, ESA itself, that name is Vernon's. And by the way, he got a Nobel Prize too.
I want to open my statement with remarks on the difference in research attitudes between Germany and the US in the early time of experimental economics. This is maybe the 60s of the last century. I think we were even a little earlier than the United States. In the US, the work of Vernon Smith of the double oral auction, on the double oral auction in 1961 was a brilliant success. It suddenly turned out that the classic concept of competitive equilibrium is a good predictor for the result obtained after a series of identical repetitions of markets for one good, even if the markets are quite small. This suggested similar possibilities of success with other predictions of rational theory. The confirmation of rational theory therefore became the main goal of experimental research in the US. The origin of German experimental economics was different. In the planning of an oligopoly experiment, described in the paper by Heinz Sauermann and myself, ein Oligopol-Experiment, and during this design and preparation of this experiment, we were well aware of Herbert Simon's work on bounded rationality, and at least I myself was fully convinced that this was the right approach to decision-making. And we were not surprised to see that realistic theories of human economic behavior cannot be based on strong rationality assumptions. Our experimental results convinced us of the necessity of exploring the structure of boundedly rational behavior. This resulted in a theoretical paper trying to further develop H.A. Simon's approach to bounded rationality. Sauermann und Selten, Anspruchsanpassungstheorie der Unternehmung, 1962. The beginning of experimental economics in Germany was at Frankfurt with Professor Sauermann and myself. We had there for about 10 years a consecutive, small research groups of 3 or 4 people, which always worked on experimental projects financed by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. And our work in Germany has not been very much looked at, even if later this was not in German language, but mostly in English language. But it was not looked at that much because the American research aims were different. We wanted to get insights into bounded rationality. This was our main purpose. And in the United States, one tried to ignore bounded rationality. And that is an attitude in economic research which is still widely spread, but in experimental economics, the gap narrowed over time. Already this is shown clearly by an overview by an article by Plot and Gresser and Plot on preference reversal at the end of the 70s, where they clearly say that, I mean, they tried to refute the experiments preference reversal. They had many criticisms of the earlier experiments on preference reversal. And they then tried to build in experimental procedure where they carefully avoided all these arguments against it. And they found more preference reversal than in the original papers. So they concluded that there must be probably some differences, some very deep principles involved. Why behavior of the subjects in the laboratory is different from what would be predicted by axiomatized utility theory. This was preference reversal was most shocking for the classical economists because there was an area of axiomatized theory and it clearly predicted this. Now, of course, preference reversal is only one of several phenomena which were called anomalies. And I tried to talk of them as regularities. They are not anomalies, but just descriptions of regular behavior. And so this was a different style of thinking about all this, which also led to different research areas. I want to close my remarks on experimental economics with a word on how I look at the future of experimental economics. Of course, the attempts to just verify or not verify these results of rational theorizing will still go on for a while, but they finally will be diminished very much in favor of the research of the structure of bounded rationality. And you see this also in the American literature now. I mean, much emphasis is now put on learning and on such things as levels of reasoning. This is called theory of levels of reasoning, which has been first suggested by the work of Rosinagel, and this is now very prominent in the literature. And then we get, in this way, we will get more insight into bounded rationality, and our economic theory will become more realistic in this way. And I think experimental economics can do much for reshaping economic theory into a more realistic body of knowledge.
Let's see. So next up is John Cagle. Let me mention a couple of things that I forgot to say. Professor Zelton meant to be with us in person today, but it's only in the last few weeks some health issues came up and he had to give this instead. What's a pioneer? Our definition, working definition, was someone who was doing it since, we're calling 50 years since Vernon Smith's key paper published in 1962. So someone was doing within 10 years of that and still ticking. That's a pretty good definition of a pioneer.
Even if just barely.
And I also wanted to say that it's not just the path-breaking intellectual contributions that these four pioneers have provided that created experimental economics that we know today, but also their statesmanship. All of them have been so inviting and welcoming to new people at key times. I must say that I got intellectual and personal inspiration from each of the four of them, as did many of you in this room or your advisors. So with that, let me turn it over to one of the three pioneers who's here in person.
Okay, so first I'd really like to thank Dan and John for inviting me to this conference, and I'm extremely delighted that I'm still ticking too. So, you know, my early career was trying to be an economic historian, so here's some history. The third experimental econ workshop here at Westward Look had 57 people showed up, 20 of whom were from the University of Arizona. The percentage from North America was 100%, and obviously from the rest of the world was 0. Now, I must say, you know, I was thinking about this. I got some official stats on this. But, you know, there were earlier ones, and show you how things have changed. If I remember correctly, the first one I came to, I swear there were just 12 of us, like the apostles, and we sat around a table, and to tell you how things changed so much, the big distinction was smokers were on one side of the table, and non-smokers were on the other side of the table. Now, today you can't even smoke except if you're in the middle of the road here, right, or something like that. At any rate, so here's some data from the World Conference in 2011. There were 284 people showed up, and equally divided between the U.S. and the European Union. I would say that was in Chicago, so probably gave us a leg up on that. As you can see, the membership in 2010, it's a little bit out of date, but you've got the stats are right there, and there's been a real flowering in EU and in Asia and other places. I think we have a thriving experimental economics community at this point, which is part of the mainstream in economics. And you can find experimenters collaborating with, getting feedback from, and criticism from theorists, econometricians, and the rest of the profession. Note that criticism is important. At a minimum, it shows that experimental work isn't not being ignored. Evidence of being part of the mainstream, if I look through who was on the editorial boards of the AER and Econometrica, picked out people who are primarily known for their experimental work or a significant component of their work. The AER has 6 people on the board that fall into that category. Econometrica's lagging, they only have 2. Early on, when I got really wacky reports from editors and referees that were clueless how to do experiments, I would write back, okay? And I wouldn't write back to give them a really hard time. I would write back and figure I was engaged in this big educational process. I mean, if you're running rats and pigeons and you're trying to sell it for economics now, you've got to try to explain this to people. So I would write back, and every once in a while, you know, they might change their mind. But one of the things, the idea was to educate them. Now, over the years, I continued to do that, and now I find that a number of these editors and referees are conducting experiments of their own, so this is real progress. Changes over time in experiments and relationships to teaching economics. Samuelson's textbook in the 60s that I grew up on, the introductory economics textbook at the time, claimed economics was inevitably a non-experimental science. Today you can find examples of experimental results in many major textbooks. I use it as an essential part of my teaching introductory economics. It's just so boring to be up there and lecturing to them, and they want to fall asleep. And it's much more fun to do an exercise. And I remember one time I was doing something on illicit markets, and one of my students said, I wrote back to my mom and I told her I was a drug dealer today. Okay. There are also texts explicitly written by experimenters for integral use in the classroom. Bergstrom and Miller was one of the first ones. Charlie Holt has one. And as I said, pedagogical tool. Some of the changes in how I see experiments, how experimenters conduct themselves and how their work is evaluated. At one time, I felt that a lot of the experiments just came through and they kind of rolled out a theory, did an experiment, they kind of gave the theory a grade, okay? This is a C minus, this is a B plus, you know, kind of something along those lines, although not quite as explicit as that. And one of the key things I think that has changed is that you now need to explain why the theory is working when it works. I mean, is it the same mechanism that we're talking about within the theory, or is it some other mechanism? As well as when it fails to work, what are the essential elements of that? And so I no longer like to think about testing economic models. I far prefer the adjective exploring economic models because I think that's really what we're engaged in. More and more experimental work is becoming characterized by a series of experiments, particular issues, conducted by different experimenters with competing interpretations of the results or methods employed in earlier experimental studies, along with some strong criticism regarding the validity of experimental results. This has sometimes resulted in strong controversies. I remember one time Jim Cox walked in, he was going to say something about some of my work on auctions and some of the things I had argued with him about, and he came in with a box and it said small arms ammunition or something like that. But I think that's a real sign of maturity when we can have a real... Sorry about that.
Toy arms.
Real sign of maturity when we can argue among ourselves. And have a really, good one. Okay. More and more we're seeing field experiments, both for better understanding how real people behave, as opposed to our typical lab population of undergraduates, and for public policy purposes. I applaud this work and would call attention to a very early field experiment circa 1979 that I did with Ray Battaglio and Robin Winkler on energy interventions, as well as the parallel experiment by Jimmy Walker looking at energy demand in a master metered apartment complex. And talk about starting someone off with a very weird dissertation, and that was it, okay? I have one small quibble with the way these field experiments are treated at some of the meetings. There are sessions called field experiments as opposed to embedding these presentations in the subject matter the experiment is designed to deal with. I would like to see that done more and more. I don't think that it's, I think we are all in the same business, so to speak, of understanding behavior. A note about theories derived from experimental data. They're designed to explain, I think that they're really different than the traditional theories. And they're designed to be wrong. My old teacher, Ed Ames, said, the important thing, everyone's wrong, but the important thing is to be wrong, but for the right reasons. And I don't think that's how theorists have typically viewed their work. So I had, in the early papers by Fair and Schmidt and Bolton and Ockenfeld's models of other regarding preferences, it was quite clear from the beginning that they had to be wrong, that they had to be or incomplete. And at the time they were offered, but what they did do, they generated a number of new and interesting experiments that would not have been conducted otherwise, leading to more nuanced and accurate models. And I think that's how the distinction is between theories derived from experimental data and non-experimental data. Thank you.
Well, this is a lot of fun. It's especially to see, to learn that I'm not the oldest guy in the in this association. But it's a real honor to be part of this this association, and I'm going to do a little reflecting, a little philosophizing. I don't really write much or talk about philosophy. My view of experiments is basically you don't talk about it, you just do it. But I'll venture out a few little comments like that. Actually, it comes from this. A lot of my philosophy of experiments is right there. Alfred says political economy or economics is a study of mankind in the ordinary business of life. I think he's wrong. I think we're the study about the principles that operate during the ordinary business of life. Now to me that's an important distinction, because it says I'm not really that interested in history. I'm interested in the structure of principles, and in order to understand principles, I might not need to go to history or existing situations as nature has chosen them. I might need to look at systems, things that are very simple, unrealistic, because those are the places I might be able to see what nature has uncovered. If I wanted to go back to a realistic situation, nature's already hidden it from me. So the thrust is typically in my research, you'll see, is not necessarily becoming more realistic. It's actually the opposite. It's uncovering complexities. So in some sense, I can get a glimpse at the underlying principles that are there. So if you take a look at my work, it's that thesis runs all the way through it. So with that, I always started, this is a little something I started out when right after I got introduced to experiments by Vernon. We were fishing, and Vernon was drawing pictures of an Edgeworth box and how the double auction converged to an equilibrium. And I walked away from that and I said, Vernon's a smart guy, but he really does not understand markets. He's thinking that the market operates on the wrong principles. The basic principles he's using are wrong. Now, why is that? Well, because in a double market, with every trade, the equilibrium changes. So if he sees the convergence to the equilibrium, he must have it wrong, because that equilibrium must be changing with every trade. So I trotted off and going to show Vernon was wrong, and is a miserable failure. He was really right. And then that left me with a major curiosity. How could that possibly be? Right? Not that he was right. I was kind of accustomed to that. But this thing could converge. So I thought that basically it was a Bayesian game, that they were building up their priors. And since then, I've abused myself of that theory as well. I don't know why markets converge. I have some ideas. But I started with a fundamental equation that, namely, most of the models and principles we look start with something called preferences. We combine that with institutions and information. We combine that with feasibility, and we cannot forget that economics draws out of a fundamental law of scarcity. The commodity space and the structure of the commodity space as the basic axiomatic structure of what we theorize about cannot be overlooked. And from those, we're supposed to predict the outcomes. So we're supposed to be able to using principles. Now, when we started out, the principles typically were principles of individual behavior. That's where John started, really asking, can it be that creatures optimize? No more complex than that. And he's looking at rats. He wasn't looking at very complex things because he was saying, I want to know, in the simplest case, can this underlying principle be operating? And I'll let him discuss whether he was useful, whether he was successful or not, but I think so. The next is Nash. We see Nash equilibriums all the time. We also had cooperative games. We were talking about market equilibrium. Now, each one of these things is really a different set of principles, and you'll see them flopping back and forth on them as we do our experiments. More recently, we talk about system dynamics. Turns out, it looks like the laws of economics are actually not in the equilibrium, but in the structure of the dynamics that gets you to the equilibrium. So we start looking at the principles in terms of movement, which is quite different from just looking at the solutions of a game. We're also seeing rule evolution. We can see in these markets and other situations as the rules themselves begin to evolve, and we're even beginning to see a slight theory of that called design. While we don't think of designs and optimal designs as a theory of the creation of institutions, that's exactly what it is. We're asking what type of design would solve this or that problem. Whether nature discovers it or not, it's a completely different thing. Now, I find it interesting, when we started working on this, most of the time we just assume the preferences are fixed. Now we're beginning to see an evolution of this as people ask, well, what features are those preferences? Do they have to do something with the attention? What about your physiological environment? Does that affect those preferences? So we're beginning to see more and more theories and principles about what it is that gives those things shape, which is quite a difference in perspective. I see it really strongly in this meeting today, as more and more questions are actually focused on the individual. Now, there's just something I can mention. As we look at these different sets of principles, we have a little bit of a tension of tendency, which I think is bothersome, to think that we have a monopoly of principles. And I think all of you guys have had papers rejected, which basically said you should have explained it according to X. Either I had to go back to psychology, and I'm wrong, or I had to go back to Nash equilibrium, and I'm wrong, or I had to look at principles of cooperative game theory, and I'm wrong. So even now, we're beginning to see this tension, I think, between the basic principles that we tend to accept and think that we, namely my most current research, has a monopoly. I think that that's wrong, and I think we should really be aware of it. Okay, let's go on with this. So what I'm saying is, beware of thinking that there's only one set of principles. Right now, we have several different sets of principles. Now, here's another kind of interesting thing. Models tend to work because the principles do not. So you think of principles as being something that absolutely is reliable. No, most of the models and many of the models we see work because the basic principles in the market don't. For example, take price taking in a competitive industry. No one treats the price as a constant, yet the competitive model works quite well, right? So a basic feature of that model, we could reject the model easily, but the model still works. How about Nash equilibrium? Think about Nash over time, the dynamic or Nash responses. That's a highlight of irrationality. We have the Nash players continuously being mistaken and never learns, but yet the Nash model converges down to the equilibrium, which is really quite remarkable. Or what about a monopoly in general equilibrium? None of you fellows ever worked through the implications of monopoly in a multiple market system. He always never anticipates the impact of his price on other prices back to the resources he's buying. We cut off the string of sequences in that, even that model. Partial equilibrium, gigantic example of irrationality. Why is that? Well, we're assuming all of these other things are constant. They're not. So my comment is that many of our models are there, but we use the principles quite well, but don't get married to them because the success is frequently due to a feature of that model itself where the principle is being violated. Okay, so those are just agendas. Okay, now, causality measurements without theory. The methods there seem to be a little different. I won't touch that for right now, but I'm a little bothered by it. Do proper methods exist? Here's a good one. Which comes first, theory or data? In almost all of my research, the data comes first. I'll look at an experiment and say, I should be able to explain this, and I ask what models will help. And so I want to know where they fall short and how they might be improved. In fact, Vernon's first experiments in markets were that way. Vernon said he was testing the competitive equilibrium, but he really wasn't because he didn't have any of the features of that theory in his experiment. He looked at the data and he says, wow, how could that possibly be? And that set the stage of inquiry as he started changing parameters and changing this theory and trying to understand the phenomena that he started with. It was the phenomena that came first, not the theory. So that's just something I could point out to you, that many of the things that I studied really are upside down. It's the data first and then theory. And there's nothing wrong with theory first, it's just there's no monopoly of that way of looking at it. Here's something else that might be a little controversial. For theoretical work, the external validity is a trap. I think it's a trap. Why is it a trap? Well, because it suggests that the way you could learn about economics is going to this complex thing that nature created. But that's the reason you're doing an experiment. It's because nature is hiding what she's doing. So to try to think that you're going to mirror nature is to make your experiment more complex than you need to. The thing you do is remove some of that. Now, you can always go back, but when you first look, just to look at external validity as a reason for an experiment, I think it's a trap, and I think it's something that will cause some problems for you. Okay, what do we want to know when we talk about external validity? Basically, we study the simple, as in markets, so we can understand the complex. So it's a move from the simple experiment in the hopes that we can understand this more complex thing. To do that, we're basically not talking about the truth of our models, we're talking about the robustness of our models. As we observe it in the simple case, does it work in the simple case? Does it continue to work in the much more complex case? So it's robustness we're talking about and not theory testing. Okay, I guess that my last word is for those of you who don't know it, you want to test lots and lots of time before you go into your design, because almost surely you screwed up your experiment before you start gathering the data. Thank you.
Well, I'm not going to tell you young guys what you ought to be doing. I never listened to the old guys when I started. And because they were telling me that I shouldn't be doing experiments, that it wasn't economics. And I just, it was so fascinating what I was doing that I decided to do it, even if it was wrong. And also, concerning the future of experimental economics, at any time in the past, I would not have been able to predict what would have happened 10 years later. You know, that was true in 1962 and 72 and 82 and 92. So why should I be able to even pretend that I would be able to tell you what might be in store for us? I do want to, coming back to Reinhard's comment on kind of what he said was a spectacular success of the double auction. I want to point out that this is an important anniversary that most of you don't even know exists. It's the 150th anniversary of the guy who's kind of more than anyone responsible for equilibrium economics, the marginal analysis, and that was an Englishman. Reinhard should focus his guns on William Stanley Jevons. In 1862, his paper was read at the Royal Society and a very short abstract published. And it was a mathematical theory of political economy. And that is, that event really is responsible for the education that we've all grew up with. That's where equilibrium economics came from. It's where the notion came that somehow as individuals we go to the market and we have all these preferences, and then we behave in accordance with those preferences. That work, and of course it's mostly associated with the 1870s because that's when that work started to really come to fruit. And that displaced the tradition that had started in 1776 with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And so what I want to mostly talk about and suggest, and I heartily recommend, although I'm not going to tell you what to do in your experiments, I heartily recommend some bedtime reading for you. And not at night before you go to sleep, but in the morning when you first wake up, because it is hard reading. And that's Adam Smith's first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. This is an unbelievably deep treatment of human sociality. Smith believed it was his most important work, and he was right. I think it was. But it was completely eclipsed by the spectacular success of The Wealth of Nations, because it got picked up, you know, after the American Revolution, because it was clear that The Wealth of Nations had it right. And the British imperialists did not have it right. And that eventually changed much of the world. And so the theory of moral sentiments got completely swept aside. It's not, and in rereading it, it's not a matter of finding something that is lost, because it was never found. You're not, I mean, this never got to be part of our thinking, okay? And, but here's the main way to think about it. Sentiments is about a pre-civil order, an order of close-knit community of family, extended family, neighbors, and you could call it, and tribes. There is no third-party enforcement of property. What is allowable and what is not allowable involves rules that emerge by consent. And this book, if your main interest is in auctions and markets and that sort of thing, you won't really find much in this book to inform you in your current work, because you are operating in a world with third-party enforcement of property, okay? That's the world of markets and auctions. But what you will learn something about is what Adam Smith had to say about where those rules came from. They didn't come from the legislature, as Jeremy Bentham, if you can believe it, actually believed. And by the way, Jeremy Bentham influenced William Stanley Jevons. They came out of small communities and an incredible amount of experience. Sentiments is not utilitarian. It's not about outcomes. It's not about equilibrium. It's about conduct. It's about rules governing conduct. It's about fitness, the fitness between conduct and the rules governing conduct. Smith uses the word pleasure. Don't think utility. It's not utility. It's the pleasures of mutual sympathy. It's fellow feeling. It has to do with aspects of human sociality that we no longer think of it in that way with all of our utility functions. When he talks about fairness, he's talking about fair play, because the opposite of fair is not unfair, it's foul. It's about self-command. You're not taking into account others because their reward is in your utility function. It's about self-command. It's about humbling the arrogance of your self-love to bring it down to what other people will go along with. He uses that phrase, go along with, what people will go along with, what the impartial spectator will go along with, what men will go along. He uses that over and over again. And I think this is a perspective, as I say, it's very hard, and I first read it, I didn't get it. And because I hadn't escaped, you know, a way of thinking about it that came from my Harvard education. You see, in sentiments, the isolated individual is only a counterfactual and a beautiful mental experiment in which Adam Smith says, imagine that a person is brought up in some place of isolation and has no communication whatsoever with other members of his species. He will have any idea. He will have no idea of what it means for his mind, and Adam Smith is talking about the social mind. He will have no more of an idea what it means for his mind to be deformed than for his face to be deformed. And Smith says, bring him into society and you give him the mirror he needs. So it's all about, really, or at least half of it, is seeing ourselves as others see us. The great Scottish poet Robert Burns, who was Adam Smith's contemporary, one of the many brilliant people that came out of the Scottish Enlightenment like some kind of out of nowhere and disappeared after 45 years, but left an incredible legacy. And it's also, you see, the book is very much about propriety. Motivation is, what is the human motivation? We seek praise and to be praiseworthy, avoid blame and to be blameworthy. It's about propriety, but propriety becomes property. It's interesting that John Locke, in his first book, this was, you see, written, this is 50 years, 75 years before Adam Smith was writing, he talked about, in the first edition of his book, he talked about propriety rights, because that was the language of the time. Well, that's beautiful, because propriety rights, that tells you where the property rights come from. Okay, it's about approval or disapproval of the group. Okay, the rights to take action. So Adam Smith uses certain principles that come out of these close-knit communities to then tell us why it is that property rights take the form that they take in the civil order. Hurtful actions are resented in these communities, and in the civil order, therefore, they are punished. And the punishment for murder is greater than the punishment for property, for violation, for robbery and theft, which is greater than violation of promises. Why this last two? Well, he derives that from the asymmetry between gains and losses. Theft only dispossesses you, theft dispossesses you of what you already have. Violation of a promise merely dispossesses you of your expectation of gain. And it's interesting because you see that's theft and robbery are criminal. Violation of promises are merely civil, okay? And also out of this comes the notion of justice as the absence of injustice. We do not reward justice. You don't get a reward for driving through a green light. You only get a citation if you fail to stop for a red light. And so to Adam Smith, justice is what's left over. It's the residue after you have agreed on what's unjust and what's to be punished. This book was a prolegomena to The Wealth of Nations. In fact, I never knew it, never realized it, but you can't understand The Wealth of Nations if you haven't read The Theory of Moral Sentiments, because he doesn't plagiarize himself by repeating all that stuff again. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.